It is the story of life, the story of our lives, wrapped up in a beautiful golden crown of grace.
Great nation does not hide its history. It faces its flaws and corrects them.
Ruth's father, Elijah Odom, was born into servitude in Mississippi. He was born a slave. As a young boy, he ran, though, to his freedom. He lived through Reconstruction and he lived through Jim Crow. But he went on to farm and graduate from medical school and gave life to the beautiful family that we see today. Their family will join us in ringing a bell from the First Baptist Church in Virginia, one of the oldest black churches in America, founded under a grove of trees in 1776. And the sound of this bell will be echoed by others in houses of worship and town squares all across this country. An echo of the ringing of bells that signaled emancipation more than a century and a half ago. The sound and the anthem of American freedom. God bless you. God bless the United States of America.
Good evening and welcome to a very special edition of Bounce Around Savannah. I'm Dawn Baker. We are in the nation's capital, continuing to give you a very special look inside of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We're going to take you on a tour. The museum is purposely designed with the darkest part of history on the bottom floor. The Slavery and Freedom Gallery gives us a sense of how the Africans made it to America and their lives as slaves. The curator, Nancy Burkhall, explains what you'll learn.
Right now we're standing in front of the Edisto Island slave cabin, the Point of Pines plantation. And this is right before our section where we look at life and work. So we see this hallway as really having several bookmarks. So one bookend is the cotton gin, and that is the really America expanded greatly because of the cotton gin. And on the other end, looking outside of just work alone, we then look to how human lives were lived within this system of pretty intense brutality. And then on either side of either wall, we see the expansion of the United States in terms of how fundamental freedoms were built, and we always have the African American voice and perspective. And then on the other side, we also see the expansion of the nation through the domestic slave trade. So our nation is always bookended by these different factors of both slavery and freedom working in tandem, side by side, and often horrifically juxtaposed to one another. Well, the slave cabin certainly was an object that completely and absolutely stunned me because of the feelings that you felt within the cabin. So when I said that you could feel human lives within that structure, so many of the objects that we've collected, you can actually feel the energy generated from the object. You can feel the human lives within them.
In acquiring this house, you got to talk with both sides, the descendants of slaves as well as the masters, the owners.
Yes.
It must have been unreal.
It was very unreal. So we talked to descendants of slaveholders and descendants of people who are enslaved. And one thing I have to say that's just surprised me is that no matter where we go, people step forward and share their stories with us. But I think this is the blessed work that the Smithsonian is doing. That as a national museum, going out through the country and asking and inquiring about these histories, people come forward and begin to share. And they share regardless of their background. And what's important about this is there's something about an object where an object is quiet enough that people share their memories of that object. And in the process of sharing their memories, they begin to hear each other's stories. I'm not sure that healing comes of it, but I am amazed at the communities that we've created as we've gone across the nation and collected, that people have come together in ways that really surprised me. The other horrifying object that was something that I actually had to take a step back from and actually gather myself was a bullwhip that came into our collection. And the first time that we saw that in storage, that was just a moment that you don't quickly recover from. The same is true of very humble objects, paper objects, like slave deeds of sale. There are other objects that can fill you with great joy. They're objects of things that people made. So we have a small skirt that's on view. It's Lucy Shirley's skirt, and it's from Loudoun County, Virginia. And her mama made that for her, or someone who loved her made her that skirt when she was enslaved in Virginia. And that's one thing that we should never forget, is that regardless of what was happening to people, they continued to love. And that's something they continue to love. And when families are torn apart, they found new family. They found through kin, through community, they found a way to actually open their hearts again. And for me, that is the most profound story that we can tell. That is perhaps the greatest gift that I hope we can learn from. And for me, it's 400 years of learning about that gift. It's about time we heard it.
Slavery to freedom. You'll see it all right here at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Welcome back to Bounce Around Savannah. We're continuing our tour of the Slavery and Freedom Gallery. One of the main exhibits focuses on a time known as the Middle Passage.
Explores really the different nations and the different peoples living in those two areas, and then it moves all the way through the transatlantic slave trade and the Middle Passage. It then looks at colonial North America and how people encountered slavery along the way and what forms of slavery took place and how was freedom becoming manifest. Then it moves through American history. So we have the American Revolution viewed through the lens of the African American experience, the paradox of liberty, which is really the founding of our nation. And then this area where we're standing in here is the antebellum era. So this is right before the Civil War. This is the nation from 1790 all the way up to 1860. We became really fundamentally a world economic leader and a world military might in this time period. And this is really the foundation for how America assumed its place on the world stage. With the Middle Passage, what we really want people to understand is really the power and profit that was gained through the slave trade and also the human cost. So we focus on the fact that over 12 million Africans were kidnapped and sold from different parts of Africa. So they weren't just Africans, they were Igbo, they were Fan, they were Congo. So these people from all different areas of the western coast of Africa were kidnapped and sold into slavery. Often they were marched many miles before they actually came to the coast. Once they were on the coast, they were housed in jails called barracoons. The barracoons became infamous because you could smell them a great distance away. So people were treated fairly brutally. These were men and women and children. After a person was placed into a barracoon, then someone would come up and try to purchase them. There would often be an auction for these human beings. Then people would be torn apart from one another. They would be placed on board a ship, and that ship would then move further up the coastline with more people. So often you were on board ship for sometimes up to 3 months. During this time period, you're often shackled. You're certainly below decks. They had something called tight packing, and they had something called loose packing. Tight packing was if you put as many people on board as possible, and what they thought, certain people will die, but still we'll get over to the other side and we'll still have a good profit. So that was one philosophy of transporting people. So the first thing you definitely should take note of are the Middle Passage ballast stones. These are stones that came off of a ship that was sunk off the coast of South Africa. The ship was built in Lisbon, Portugal. It sailed down to Mozambique, picked up 400 souls began to sail on its way to Brazil and crashed off the coast of Cape Town. And 200 people lost their lives on that ship. But they knew that they had actually found a ship that was carrying human cargo because of the ballast stones. Ballast stones for human bodies are different than ballast stones for other forms of cargo. They're larger and they're heavier to displace the weight of a human body, which is much more full of water and blood than other objects. And so that really is incredibly profound and moving. The way that we decided to treat that space was not to tell necessarily we treat the entire story of the Middle Passage, but we wanted that space to once again be a more sacred space where people could move within that space and reflect, and really to pay homage to those who gave their lives at this moment in time.
You may not know the face, but I'm sure you've heard the name Robert Smalls, former slave, Civil War hero, and a whole lot more. We'll have more about his story when Bounce Around Savannah continues. More than 100 years of planning, the museum is finally here, and we're going to take you inside. Look closely and you'll see exhibits in the Slavery and Freedom Gallery that explain where those slave ships docked. By 1775, they had transported 117,500 Africans to the Low Country. One of those descendants of the Africans was Nat Turner, a fiery preacher and militant leader who organized a slave uprising that struck a defiant blow against slavery 30 years before the Civil War. He was put to death in 1831.
Nat Turner's Bible was actually brought forward to the museum and donated to the museum back in 2011. Who can imagine that Nat Turner's Bible even survived? So Nat Turner was really known for he was an incredibly intelligent man. He was a minister who ministered to both black and white within his county. The fact that we have his Bible that speaks so much to him and to who he was is something that will never, ever cease to amaze me.
It is certainly exciting to see that you all have more information about him, because the history you read is definitely not positive about his mission and what he did.
That could just be that people haven't really fully asked a lot of the questions that need to be asked. So we found that throughout working on this exhibit, is that much of this history has not really been, historians have certainly delved into this history, but so much of this history is actually hidden in plain sight.
Another key figure, Robert Smalls, enslaved on a Beaufort, South Carolina plantation, overcame that mighty obstacle to find a prominent place in American history.
He comes to fame because he actually commandeers a Confederate ship and takes it to the Union lines and becomes a soldier in the Union Army, but afterwards becomes a congressman. And I think he's one of the earliest congressmen and is a very important figure in terms of forcing Congress to think about issues of civil rights and the proper treatment of African Americans.
Nancy Burkhall maintains that slavery, while abolished in the U.S. back in 1865, impacts our lives today.
Before the Civil War, and of course after, but before the Civil War it was legal, correct? It was legal to enslave human beings. Those human beings were being marked by the fact that they were designated African Americans. This meant that even free people of color became people who were also very regimented and whose lives were restricted. So there were certain codes, and we have them all listed here on the floor, of what people could do and couldn't do. So citizenship was not equally shared by all. So the fact that if you're walking down the street, the fact that simply because of the way you look, that you could be stopped, you could be arrested, and you could be sold into slavery is something that's a good over 200 years old in America. And so I think that some of those habits continue on within our culture because it was legally grounded in the very early beginnings of the nation. I'm really hopeful that people will understand that this movement in American history, that so much of what we're living in today, both are means of resisting and protesting what we see as being an oppressive or unjust system has its roots so far back that this is the work really of ancestors. So that if you come through the Slavery and Freedom exhibition, you'll see that people were using the power of their bodies, the power to gather, the power of protest, in order to force America really to change. I would say the Emancipation Proclamation came about because of the actions of enslaved African Americans. And so regardless of whether or not you have the right to vote, you have the right to speak with your body and to be heard. This is a tradition that goes far back. Same with the intellectual tradition, the rhetoric for actually building an idea of a more just America really began with Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. Ira Berlin, a very famous historian, has just written a book saying that the reason that we really point to the Declaration and the reason we really point to those words, all men are created equal, is because of African American intellectuals in this time period. So I would say that the means by which we claim our rights, the means by which we express our rights, have this really long tradition.
More than a century of lobbying and planning, and now the National Museum of African American History and Culture is finally a reality. Organizers believe sharing this history will lead to unifying our country.
One thing I find so exciting about this museum is that by telling this history, we will really understand each other so much better. You can't go through the slavery galleries, through the Slavery and Freedom Gallery, without really understanding how really this history is a foundation of where we're living today. So much of what we experience today was set in motion. And I think really by understanding this past, instead of running from this past, instead of rendering this past invisible, will make people, or will invite people to really fully understand where these patterns of behavior, where our economic wealth has come from, how political power has been structured. All of these things are just critical to understanding the nation. And so it's really, I think, a blessed thing that really will help everyone understand really who we are. I don't think we fully know who we are and what can be possibly bad about that.
Look who we ran into, civil rights icon Reverend Jesse Jackson. He's overjoyed about this museum finally becoming a reality after so many years and the impact it could make on our country.
African Americans are not the bottom of American society, we're the foundation. And that's the difference. The bottom is where you end up, foundation is where you begin from. Unlike there's a refugee tradition, there's an immigrant tradition, and there's a slave tradition. We say callously, came on different boats in the same boat now. We came on very different boats with different ports. Those that came in the port of New York came on the deck of ships, being welcomed. Those that came in the hull of ships in Charleston and New Orleans were welcomed to hostility and this be seen as a commodity. And so to put this into American history makes America in time a greater nation because, and you should know the truth, and the truth should set you free. Why are we still at the bottom though we were at the founding? Because of the continuation of the legacy of racism, structural and personal racism, and the manipulation of race, setting people against people. We'll be a great nation when one day we can have an even playing field.
Thanks for joining us for this very special edition of Bounce Around Savannah from the nation's capital. We hope that you make a trip to D.C. to see this museum for yourself, but plan some time, though, because there are 40,000 donated items and 400,000 square feet. Good night, everyone.